primary dock space and have slips off that dock. Basically, we would be removing 10 slips, adding 69 for a net of 59 more slips. Currently, we have 67 total. We hope that in the end we'll have about 116 in total once we do this build out. Currently, there are no concrete parking ordinances or parking in your ordinance. The way it typically is worded is that all uses that you have on site, you have to apply the parking for each separate use and then add those up to get their parking total for the site. It's kind of unusual because on a marina like this, it's more of a total business. But for the sake of parking, we looked up typical marina type parking for either whether you have slips or whether you have boats in storage. And then we use the numbers that you have in your ordinance relative to number of employees in retail space. By the plan, if you put that independently, you're looking at about 160 spaces. We have about 130 marked out on the site between the retail, the current employee spaces, and what we did was on the rock area, we have assumed that everything there would be 10-foot wide parking to be conservative. We're not going to have the stripe lines evidently on the rock and whatnot, so be a little.
I'm sorry, where are you talking right now?
I'm going to walk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I got my pointer. You want a pointer?
Oh, look at that.
I forgot my pointer. Bottom one?
Yep.
Right there, right there. This right here is all gravel area.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done there to portion out what parking could be on there is we use the typical parking aisle dimension, 24 feet down through there, an 18 wide deep space. But for the width of it, we assumed all those cars that would be parked up there that we have in the summer take up a 10-foot space versus a 9-foot space, which is in your ordinance, just to be a little more conservative on it. So with that layout, we currently have the ability to park about 130 vehicles on the site. Feel that should be sufficient for our uses based upon the overall marina use for the property, but I wanted to get that parking calculation out there so that we'd have a little conversation on it. We have reached out to DEP. There's certainly, we have to come through the town because of the shoreline ordinance. We're not really doing any shoreline work. We're actually doing everything waterside. That will require a Natural Resources Protection Act permit from the DEP. We've also reached out to the Army Corps of Engineers preliminarily and going back and forth and trying to figure out what it is we need to do with them relative to the permitting for the expansion. What we know today, what we believe today is the depth of the water in that area is such that it will not fall under submerged lands. So we do not have to apply for a submerged land lease because of the difference between the natural water elevation and the controlled water elevation of Lake Sebago, or Sebago Lake. I think I gave you quite a bit of information there and be more than happy to have a dialogue with you so that we can see how we move forward.
Okay.
Can I ask, so before we add anything, any more boat slips, I think you said you have 130 parking spots?
What I did was I just kind of laid out what we feel that we can fit on the site
Gotcha.
right now.
So how many parking spots did we have before we made any changes with number of boat slips? I'm just wondering if the number of parking spots you've had have seemed to be adequate, and if they have, the percent of increased boat slips, are you sort of increasing your parking by that percent?
There's been no parking calculation or real parking study done to the site. It's existed for quite a while in its current state and whatnot. So relative to the use of the parking, we do have some flexibility for cars out there. They pretty much randomly park when they come. That's why when we figured out what the parking would be, we didn't assume it'd be a 9-foot space. We don't have a desire to go down and pave that. By DEP rules, we could pave over rock and still be considered impervious, but it's not what the typical marina is right now. So what we just did was we elaborated and took what we have for existing area and tried to figure out what it would park.
And it seems like that'll be enough.
We, based upon some of the stuff relative, once again, not a lot of people have marina parking in their ordinance, not even in Maine. So we went out there, and that's why I got the 0.6, varies from 0.45 to 0.65, depending upon literature relative to slips, and then 0.2 for your stored boats. There's actually been a study that they did on July 4th at a particular one where it fell just about the 0.6 for July 4th weekend for the number of slips and whatnot. And in that case, in that parking, they didn't separate out the different uses. And we kind of did that to be a little bit conservative. Like on July 4th, we're not going to have too many people, not too many employees working, and we're not going to have too many people showing up for buying stuff on July 4th, I believe. So we were just trying to show what the maximum is we could get on there. Right now, we have not experienced any issues relative to parking with the number of slips that we have.
Okay, thanks.
So in the end, the plan will have 116 slips with 130 parking spaces. Is that pretty much what,
Correct. 116 slips is about what we'll have, yeah.
130 parking spaces?
With about the ability to park about 130 cars on there.
And there's no real change to the parking
No,
with the addition of the slips?
correct.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
Well, this is a little bit of a quibble. I'm not coming up with 130 total slips when I just add the numbers that are listed. I'm coming up with 124, but I'm wondering if maybe the 8 valet boat slips that are abutting the existing boat storage building, if that note should say 10 instead of 8. I'm missing 6 slips in here. I can't find
I
them.
apologize. I
Which would
believe I
decrease your parking by
counted them and double counted them, but I think we know that we have 67 permanent slips because that's what we lease. In the,
I think he said 130 slips.
Yeah.
it's 116. It'll be 116 in the end. We have 67 right now.
Right, but you have 130 parking spaces now.
Cor-
And you wouldn't- and
Space,
there'll be no
space for
increase-
parking 130.
And there'll be no increase to that number.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't mean
Right.
parking, I mean boat slips.
Apologize, but
I'm just adding up the numbers. You're adding 59 net after the 10 you're taking out, and then you've got 10 next to them is 69, and 32 next to that's 101, and then 15 moorings, 116, and 8 valets, 124.
We don't count the valet slips in those 67. We're counting the 67 as leased spaces.
Rob, we got to keep you on the mic.
I'm just going by
Oh,
your
you're
chart
okay.
that
Oh,
says
perfect.
130.
Excellent.
I mean, it's a quibble at this point, because this is just a sketch review, but
Correct.
I note there's a discrepancy between what I can add up for slips on the plan versus what's listed on the chart.
The whole thing is that those are the boats that come out of the storage in the building and whatnot. And we account for parking that, and that's the 0.2 per stored boat that they typically think is what your equivalent parking should be if you're having boat storage on your site. And then 0.6 parking spaces per lease slips, and that's what that is. The lease slips are these slips right here. These are our, pull the boat off the shelf and put it in the water, and somebody comes and,
But you're using the 71 existing slips to calculate your parking, but according to the count here, especially if you're omitting the 8 valet boat slips, you've got considerably less than 71 existing slips. You've got 10 plus 32 is 42, and 15 mooring is only 57,
okay, we have
if you're omitting the 8 valets.
10 spaces here, 10 spaces here, that's 20. And then we have 15 there, that's 35. 35 and 32 is 67.
Okay, explain that to me again.
Yeah.
It says existing 10 boat slips.
Yeah,
Next to the addition on the end, which is 59 net after you take out the 10 that you're removing. So you got 10 there,
10 there.
you got 32 next to it is 42, and then 15 mooring is
Yeah.
57.
Off the end here, there are 10 more.
But you're losing those 10 on the end by the additions.
Correct. So we're adding 69, so we're adding in that 59.
You're adding 59,
Net, yeah.
right, 59 net, and then you're showing 57 more excluding the valets existing. I'm just adding up what you're listing on your drawing here.
Okay, I'm losing you, so 10, 10, and 15.
Well, yeah, 10 and 32 is 42, and 15 is 57.
Bruce, are you counting where it says existing 10 boat slips?
But those are
Two
going away
spaces.
because you're adding,
But each
Okay.
has two slips in it, each space has two
Yeah.
slips.
What we're saying, we have
Is that thrown
67
It's
currently.
actually 20 where,
Yeah,
67 currently,
67 current, you're taking away 10, so now
10.
you have 57,
yeah.
right?
And
And then you're adding 56.
you're adding 69.
69.
How? You have 14 down each row, and you've got 4 rows, that looks like 56. What am I missing here?
We may be short or extra one.
You may,
But,
I mean, in order to meet your count, it looks to me like you have to extend the addition out
yeah.
several more slips on each side
Yeah.
to equal what you're showing.
I have a plan that's done up, it's a sketch of this, and it numbers from 1 to 101, 1 to,
116?
I don't
Only
remember
116.
either.
Yeah, 116?
So, our hope is to.
Well, just double check it
Yeah.
because I work in construction numbers for a living, and
Okay.
it looks to me like you've got 56 that you're adding on here.
Yeah.
4 rows of 14. That's the dark at the end.
Yeah,
So that's 56, and then you add the 57 that you have existing net left over after you lose 10. 56 and 57 is like 113.
the way they're configured here, one boat is kind of going this way versus this way. I think it does work out in the end, but I'll double check.
Just double check it.
Yeah.
And then if I could just add, if there's a plan that shows, like, that you mentioned that has numbers, maybe that would really be helpful.
I don't have that with me. It's
Oh,
a-
no, but I
it's a-
mean, in.
Yeah,
the
we can,
future.
we'll, this is just for sketch plan,
Yeah.
but we would, on our final submit, we'll probably have all those slips numbered,
Great.
so.
Okay, so we, as far as going out the slips into the water, I don't believe we have any ordinances deal with that at all.
No, we,
So-
we had talked about that
Right.
with DEPU, with what would be needed for that, and basically they're still staying under anything that would be required other than the planning board approval.
Okay,
So there's no state or town limit in terms of how far out?
No, our ordinances just dictates the width of the dock, not the length of it. It basically results back to, interfering with the navigation of the right-of-way, which is enforced by the game wardens. They're the enforcement part of that.
And once again, if we were to go out, so we go past the magic depth, then we get into the part where we have to do a submerged land lease. But what we've been told by the state is the depth of the water in the area that we propose to extend the docks does not exceed the depth, therefore we do not need to get a submerged land lease.
Great, thanks.
Jim, I need to ask a history question, which is not directly related, well, kind of directly. But when we did the, when we did the disc golf course, was that overflow parking part of the marina parking? Was there some arrangement there?
No,
Was that, that was ever discussed? Okay,
there was no discussion with the marina for that. no.
okay. There was some overflow
That
parking.
was for, the golf was gonna use the hydroponics. for overflow.
Hydroponics, that's right, okay, thanks. Did you, I'm sure you got the fire department's memo?
We did, we had a little conversation just before the meeting started. We haven't looked at it in depth, but we realized the NFPA codes and whatnot. I think there's gonna need to be further discussion of how we meet things and whatnot, so.
Okay.
I do have one more question.
Yes, sir.
The boat storage building that's closest to the 8 valet boat slips,
Mhm.
am I correct in that that is the ramp that people back their boats down into the water just to the left on the plan view of the 8 valet slips?
That's where you load your boats, right?
We do, no,
And not, people do not load.
the ramp is at the far end.
Well, come up and show us that, so we,
Okay.
yeah, tough for understand what you're saying when you're sitting
This
back
is
here.
where they bring the boats in.
That
come
looks
on
like the
down
ramp right there, that's
Yeah.
correct.
There's,
No, this is where we load them in with a forklift. Forklift only, there's no ramp here. There's a ramp down here that's used by us.
Okay.
Occasionally someone may, it's not like, there's no ramp passes or anything like that anymore.
It's not a public ramp.
It's not a public
It's strictly
ramp.
for your.
When you really can't even pay to.
What my concern is that there's adequate circling area for trucks
Trailers.
towing boats, you know, to do what they need to do to back down the ramp and turn around and everything, if there's adequate area. I think we're gonna need to see those calculations and some circles and whatnot, the turning radius is shown on the drawing, you know, before you wrap it up. That would be my
Don't-
feeling.
Don't you launch all your boats with a forklift, or most of them?
Most of them are.
And there's no public boat launch there,
There's
it's
no
just,
public boat launch. Anything
company
that's
business.
launched.
Oh, so people aren't driving their boats down there?
No.
We may launch a boat at the ramp.
Oh, okay,
But
all right,
It's
all
not
right.
open
Okay.
to
The
the
public
That-
is
That
it.
changes my comment.
Okay.
Good, yeah.
All right, well, what else would you like to hear from us?
we know there's some concerns that we gotta meet for the
The
fire
fire
department and discuss with them. Is there anything from a code enforcement or the planning board sees anything specific that they wanna draw our attention to?
Having some rather extensive experience with marinas, I could tell you there's never enough parking. So I'm wondering where, if in fact we go with the 130 spaces are in fact the end deal, where does overflow parking go?
Okay.
And I'm not saying 130 spaces, I mean, I'm not saying it has to be 135 or 100 or 140. I'm just wondering if in fact it proves to be inadequate, where would that overflow parking go to?
Okay.
could you provide the rationale that you used to determine, you know, the number of spaces you feel are necessary for the marina with the additional slips?
Okay.
With your submittal, just, I know you read it off a few
Yeah.
factors, you know, per per slip and ranges of factors.
Yeah, what I did was I did some research on marine sites, specifically to marine parking, looked at several marine studies. I had noted one that somebody had done a study during July 4th and whatnot. And they usually look at it based upon the number of slips that you have at a marina facility. They don't typically look at other side uses or whatnot. It's the boats that are the driver for the parking calc. And they vary for slips between a 0.45 and up to a 0.65. What I saw, the typical number that they said to use was 0.6 per slip. 0.6 per slip. And then for your boats that are stored boats where people call ahead and say, okay, I'm taking the boat out today, and he's going to go get the forklift and take it out of the building and put it in the water, you should count at least 0.2 spaces per each one of those. On top of that, although typically marinas, when they look at parking like a specific use, they don't count, retail here and employees here. But I added in additional spaces based upon your code on what it calls out for employees and what it calls out for retail. So that's how I came up with the 160 number. And then the 130 was what we have on site, existing employee, retail, and then what we believe we can fit in there based upon trying to be conservative on who's going to park there. And if I paved it all, I could probably put stripes and put 9-foot spaces, but I don't think we want to pave it.
With your proposal, that's all I was asking. If you
What's
could
that?
just include your calculations.
Oh, yeah.
As backup for your,
Yeah,
with your.
it's actually on the plans up in the corner. So, but
Guys are too old.
Change in impervious space, all this is now gravel, that's parking?
yeah, and we're not changing any impervious areas.
So do we need phosphorus calculations again? And if we do, they're never gonna pass.
Well, if it's existing,
It's existing,
I don't think it's always something new that would require phosphorus, not something that's already been there. At least that's what I would,
that would make sense, because we're not changing any of the
No.
parking, it's all parking
Yeah.
that's already there.
Typically on the phosphorus, for the way the state calculates it, everything that's existing is existing, and then they looked at what the
Additional.
loading can go for the remaining developed areas, and then they're restricted.
So stormwater runoff, phosphorus calculations are not going to be required, or part of the part of the application?
I don't believe so, no.
Because everything is being changed, is on the water.
But it's just exchanging,
No, I mean, everything they're all slips, it's not,
yeah, it's
we're not changing
anything, yeah.
yeah, makes sense.
happening on the land.
What?
Nothing's happening on the land.
Right.
Well, if you look at what the fire department's proposing too, it looks like there could be some changes there. I mean, if you're looking at what I'm looking at here, for just the turnaround for an apparatus, 40-foot day cab, not happening. So, I think it's reasonable to think that we're gonna have some alterations, so I think that'll probably be included in the final proposal. I mean, just looking
Right.
at the laundry list there, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be addressed, and a lot of it in the past hasn't really been negotiable, so.
I think we need to discuss a little bit more with the fire department on that end. Typically, you would like to have a radius turnaround, but I think in this instance, the restriction would be a T turnaround, and I think we could fit it within the existing confines.
Okay. So I guess as long as there are no changes, we're
Yeah.
okay with, the board's okay with
Yeah.
Buttress? And if there are, then we'll address those.
And we have to address those.
Yep. Okay.
And I'll double check them out.
What zone is this in?
Two, commercial and shoreline.
Is it in the commercial?
Front part is,
I'm sorry?
the front part
It's
is
commercial.
commercial.
I guess what my concern, I haven't looked through the manual for that. Are there any prohibitions against doing mechanical work on a boat outside in the open where it's stored, as opposed to being required to do it inside the building in the maintenance area?
I did not research that. I assume that we're gonna not do any more maintenance than what we currently do, which is in the building, right?
We do some maintenance outside.
And that's just my concern is, you know, changing the oil for an engine or something out in the open out there and spilling 5 quarts of oil. And obviously that's gonna be a runoff and a,
Well, that would be
Pollution
typically
hazard.
pulled, wouldn't it? So, you change,
Wouldn't be doing it in the water.
I would,
It would either be in a building or right outside the overhead door, where you're doing, right? But still, you know, as he points out, I think it's just
they do have
safe
a
conditions.
permit with
Yeah.
DEP relative to their use,
Yeah.
which they have to manage stuff like that. And maybe we need to take a look at that management plan to make sure that it's adequate. But they have a permit that covers the site right now because of the commercial industrial use.
Okay.
If I can, sorry to beat
Sure.
a dead horse here, but this being on 302, obviously is really busy. I think one of us brought up the question of overflow parking, and I know there's a paved area across on the other side of 302 that often stores boats. Would that be possible for overflow parking?
We would have to look at that. Right now, that's only boat storage over there. Yeah,
Oh, but could it be used?
Yeah. I
Could be
know it
used,
could
possibly,
be
yeah.
used.
we'll look at it.
People crossing the street.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that would be the other issue. I mean, there is a stoplight there, but, I mean, it's a ways off, but
Yeah.
as far as slowing down the traffic somewhat, but.
Might have to make it all right.
Mhm.
That's a good idea, and but it would then, I think, require some more
Yeah, right.
engineering to get that road a little bit
Safer.
safer. Yeah, yeah. So just a little bit, Robin, to what Kyle alluded to is, when you, in your discussions with Wayne, the board very rarely overrules the fire department.
Yeah,
So as you're going through that, if you just kind of keep that in mind, it might save a meeting.
we will work out our things with fire department before we
Okay.
come on back.
All right?
So we're on the same page.
Perfect. Unless the board has any questions? Wayne, do you need to say anything? You
No,
just, different
I
questions?
think my memo covers it.
Yep.
And meeting with them before we come back.
Okay. Okay, Rob,
Thank you so much.
thanks.
I know where he resides, so I can get it back.
Usually they steal mine at the office. I forgot to bring mine today. Thank you very much again.
All right, to the ordinance workshop.
So in case you gentlemen.
Excuse me. Place the microphone up on the podium.
Yes, I can. So many powerful laws.
Go.
Okay. For those that may not have copies, I do have some additional copies of the information that I emailed to you. Okay, perfect. The portion that we wanted to look at, as a reminder to everybody, was back a while ago, we were looking at ways to provide connectivity, and we looked, and what we came up with was unless the interior roads and future connectivity were to be publicly owned, it would be difficult to get abutting owners to join and to continue the loop or connectivity of the roads. So we looked at ways to bolster our ordinances, to promote that. And primarily, I know, Bob, you went to the Board of Selectmen to see about the idea of acceptance of roads
Right.
for public, because that was gonna be a kind of a carrot to developers. If you go with a cluster subdivision, you know, there'll be support for making that a public road. In doing so, we looked at two sections of the ordinance which you have before you tonight that we've just kind of marked up. One being the street ordinance, which is more for the quality of the road being built. But I'll start with Article 13, which ironically is open space subdivisions, but is in the land use ordinance, but in the subdivision ordinance. So it's just the way, I didn't do this, it was before me.
Yep.
And we looked at where we could add some language in there to promote the use of connectivity. I went right in the beginning, in the introduction into the policy, added a few lines there, and then we also went into purposes, and we added a section in there. Under the purposes, it was provide considerate design for public roads acceptance and striving for connectivity to adjoining developable land parcels for the purpose of vehicle and pedestrian access loops or interconnected road systems in efforts to improve traffic and emergency access safety, reduce environmental impacts, and promote interconnection of neighborhoods. And then if you continue on, I think there's one more section there. Maybe not.
Yeah, there is. You've got one more.
Why am I not finding it? Oh, okay, under 4 space standards, when we talk about the actual road design, talk about adequate road curvature design, access, and turnaround termini to and from all parcels for fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, and other emergency vehicles, meets minimal safe turning radius over all internal access streets, ways, or driveways. Road shall consider extension of right-of-ways to adjoining lands where development is possible in the future, and the planning board will promote the offering of such open space subdivision streets and rights-of-way for public acceptance. You know, Bob and I had this conversation about how do we word this. Obviously, the planning board doesn't have the authority to accept streets. That has to go to the Board of Selectmen. But we thought that if we had some language in there that basically set up that, you know, the board's mission is to guide as this moves along for public acceptance. Obviously, that's a policy issue that's bigger than the planning board and is with the Board of Selectmen. However, when we did look at that, and we had conversation with the Public Works Director, you know, we know that some of our subdivision requirements are a little outdated, and one of them is the road section itself. That's kind of where we got into the next piece, which is under the street ordinance, where we looked at basically the thickness of pavement. It was a little bit inadequate, so we beefed that up to be a little bit thicker, especially if we're going to be accepting these for public roads. We want a well-built road. We don't want anything marginal. So again, we bolstered that thickness up. And the other thing that I did was on shoulders for certain streets. And this one may be a little bit outside of my purview, but I kind of, if we're going to have road connectivity, and we're not going to have sidewalks, we do have to kind of think about bikes and pedestrian connectivity. More towns seem to be going to the shift of doing a paved shoulder for those types of activities to give a little more width in the development so that people can walk on the edge of the road without walking off the edge of the pavement.
Right.
Or for bikes to at least have a lane to ride your bike on where you're not in the actual travel way. And typically that's done, you might put a white line in or something like that. It's not perfect, it's easier to maintain, and in most neighborhoods with the traffic numbers are low, they probably work very well. Once you get into curbs and sidewalks, you change the whole drainage characteristics and maintenance program, which adds probably some substantial nuisance to the town, you know, clearing sidewalks, and the drainage aspect of it, and adds quite a bit of cost to the development. So that was just another aspect we added to looking at this whole grand scheme of things. So I'll leave it at that. We can have a discussion. There is another point of emphasis I'd like to get into afterwards, a little bit different, but in looking at this, it's something that I found.
Okay. Jim, your addition to the road standards,
Yes.
when you're talking about the right-of-way, what, is that going to change the net residential calculations?
No.
So there'll be no impact?
No change to the net density,
Okay.
net residential calculations. That is all within the confines of what we define as the right-of-way.
Okay.
It's just the travel portion itself. I did add another section in there which gets back to the connectivity, which I forgot to mention to you guys. There may be circumstances where road connectivity just by natural land features or unique land configurations doesn't work. The board, in this case I put in here, would have the ability to waive that connection requirement.
Right.
In other words, if they build out and they build into this, they come up to this bog, and it's a 40-acre bog and it makes no sense to, to build a road into it, we can just discontinue the idea of a public connectivity. And this would apply, the way we've worked this out right now, this would apply to cluster subdivisions.
Yep.
Now, the road standards could apply to all throughout.
But the road standards, I think the changes are really not just specific for.
The biggest one would be the idea of a pedestrian shoulder
Shoulder.
width.
But that's not going to
No,
just be
not
for
for
cluster division, right?
No,
That would be for all of.
be all for all
Right.
subdivisions, yeah.
And
And I
that's-
don't see that as a huge issue one way, that's just added pavement. But I do think it adds some value for pedestrians and
Yes.
for bikes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And so I'll take any questions or any comments, or we'll.
I got two things. One is a language suggestion on the second page of Article 13, under new paragraph K. It says, provide considerate design for public roads acceptance. The word considerate in there just sounds kind of fuzzy to me.
Okay.
And I'm suggesting maybe that we should say, provide designs that facilitate public road acceptance.
Yep.
Instead of the word considerate.
No, I like that, thank you.
And then my other question is under the street ordinance on page 9, where it says down at the bottom, dead-end streets, the board shall require the reservation of a 50-foot easement in line with the street to provide continuation, where it's a future subdivision is possible. How is that going to work in a land transfer situation where a guy's splitting his lot, he's got 20 acres, he's going to sell 10 acres to Joe, and there's going to be this title transfer, when you buy the land? Is it our purview, or are we involved at all in this 50-foot easement somehow being granted as a condition of the title transfer? Because the guy who buys the 10 acres, if he doesn't know there's a 50-foot easement required, and he buys it and nothing is said, and then he finds out later on, after he's already bought the parcel, that there's this easement required, that, for some people, that could be a problem logistically, or, fundamentally, or however you want to look at it. What's our responsibility there, and is that something
Well,
that could be,
I think in the
rear its
case
head?
of subdivisions, when we have a dead-end street, all we're looking for in this case is an extension of the right-of-way, or an easement, whatever you want to call it, to the adjoining property. And that would be, in this case, it would be, under the cluster provisions, it would be a town easement, basically, for the use of the town.
Right, and I can't see it being an
Burden.
acreage problem.
No,
It would be within the subdivision.
right.
So when he applies
Plans.
for the subdivision,
Yeah.
then
Right.
it's going to become an issue.
Right.
And if he doesn't want to grant it, he doesn't get the subdivision.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
right, if it's feasible.
Right.
And he doesn't want
And
to. grant it, right.
we pretty much promote that now.
Mhm.
It's on a private sector basis. And that wouldn't change in this case. I mean, if the person decides they want to have a private road, we still would ask for that extension to the adjoining property. It's just that going into the future, we kind of know the feasibility of that happening is probably pretty slim unless the same developer buys the piece parcel in the rear.
Yeah.
If it's two different developments, the chances are that happening and them getting along and sharing a private road, it's probably 50-50 at
And it's
best.
kind of the same thing, that if he wants to apply for the subdivision, it's really up to the developer whether he wants to build the private road to a public standard for future acceptance, or risk having to rip it all up and redo it to extend it, through the right of way.
And I think if you look at the road standards, to your point, private road are typically, don't have the requirement, I don't believe, of being paved. So once you get to that paved road, you're into a minor street standard, which is what the town would accept.
Right.
Yeah,
And you have a limitation on how many lots you can do on a private road too, so. And I think the interesting thing is that we've got a lot of older subdivisions which will, for all intents and purposes, were designed to be private. They're built to a public standard, but they've remained private. They're paved, they
Right.
meet all the public road
There's a lot of
standards. Yeah. So that's one thing.
Kyle,
Yes.
what are you thinking down there?
I'm gonna always side with the side of the contractor.
Yeah, I know.
And anytime we can put less restrictions on them and then, be proactive, I'm all about being proactive, but the core of the issue hasn't been very clear to me, other than we want to bring up our standards. It's all here. I think it's relatively fair. I think that you left the private street, the backlot driveway out of these revisions. I think where you're keeping it to a bigger type area, bigger size project.
Right.
It's reasonable, but
Okay.
reasonable as far, that's where I'll go
I'll
with
take
it.
reasonable, that's it.
Well,
I think it's
if
unreasonable.
I can go there, I think when you get to the cluster, you get into a
Well, I
number.
know, I don't ask you.
When you get to the cluster development, you're into a number of lots where you're gonna have to pave the street no matter what. You've gone
Yep.
over that private kind of street standard, but you're still a private road, but you're into the paved section now. So I think what I'm thinking was, if you're into the paved section, we should be endorsing those to be public roads, which is a benefit for the contractor and the development, because now they don't have to deal with the burden of maintenance on that further down the line. And for marketing, everybody wants to be on a public road versus a private road. Everybody knows at some point there's a burden on a private road. And the idea is, if we want to promote connectivity in further development and trying to condense this rather than having dead end, dead end, dead end, dead end, and wasted land, having it in a public holding is the way to do that, because when they're in private holdings, two developments don't necessarily get along, and, so I think that was kind of our big picture. To your point, we haven't seen that kind of development happen.
Right.
We're just trying to be proactive in an economy where things are still growing. It's gonna come this way eventually.
Just to synopsize, so I'm understanding this right then. We're really talking about is the difference between an 18-foot wide private street and a 20-foot wide minor street,
Right.
and the difference between 20-inch base gravel on a private road and 18-inch base gravel on a minor street.
And pavement.
Yeah, correct, yeah, so
Pavement's probably the biggest change.
Kyle's point is well taken. It's if you've got a 500-foot long road, that's gonna be a nice chunk of change. But the developer has to make that decision as to whether he's going to build it in or go back in and rip it out later.
And it becomes a marketing thing for them, whether
Sure.
if you have a paved road, a public paved road, the marketing's much easier than if you have a private gravel road.
And that would probably mean less cost for the homeowners association and maintenance fees
Correct.
and whatnot.
Right, in the long term,
Because
it's
they got
better
a
for
beefier
in the long
structure
term, it's
to
probably
begin with.
better for everybody.
Yeah, right.
So maybe there's an offset there.
And I think that's what we tried to come up with is, not just to put the burden on the developer, but to give them something back, to your point, Kyle, that's beneficial for them and the development in the long term.
Yep. I was just looking at it on the small scale, 4 to 10, where your typical subdivision that we see in the town. I just didn't want to see any more burden placed on,
And I don't-
smaller size projects in the scale of what we're
And
looking
that
at
may
here.
be something we want to look at as far as cluster, because I think cluster only qualifies once you go over 5 lots. I think that's how it's defined in our cluster ordinance. Once you go over 5 lots, you're supposed to be providing the board with both a conventional and a cluster development plan. And there's acreage involved in that too. And maybe we can go back and look at that, maybe we want to refine it, maybe it's 10, maybe 10 lots is the magic. Under 10, you're still under the conventional. Once you go over 10, it all depends on the size and the tract of the land. There's so many variables that can go into that, but maybe we can push people in a direction we want them to go.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything in here that
Prohibits or.
yeah, exactly, that prohibits the board from making the rational decision. It's not shalls, it's waivable. If it doesn't apply, just like everything else that doesn't apply.
Right.
We don't do it.
If you don't mind, the one thing that I did find in this when I was going through this whole process was our definition of net residential density. it's not clear. Under the cluster ordinance, we have one kind of formula, which I get is kind of almost like a bonus density. When you go into cluster, you get a bolster of 20%
Right.
of your lots. So that's another carrot going to cluster. But when you look at the regular subdivision, you gotta go in 34 pages before you find out you have to apply net residential calculations to the overall development of a subdivision. To me, that should be more upfront, so when people look at the subdivision ordinance, they know right off the bat, it's not a gross area thing. You gotta do this net residential calculation to figure out your number of qualifying lots. And that probably should be right up front in the criteria, right in the very beginning of the subdivision ordinance.
That, I don't think we need it, I mean, we can do that, we don't need, we're not changing anything, so we.
We're not
can-
changing, it's a change in the ordinance, all, but I'm just saying I just think it's much clearer that way, because when somebody's looking at this and they go through the clusters subdivision ordinance, they see one way to compute it. When you go through subdivision, like I said, you gotta go almost 3/4 of the way through the subdivision ordinance before you find that, oh yeah, net residential does apply to this.
No, what I was saying is that a reordering is not gonna require us to go to a town meeting to get reordered. I think we can do
I
that.
think the only thing would be is if, it's not about reordering, I think it's just about making making a statement in the very beginning of the subdivision ordinance where you have your review criteria.
Mhm.
I think that net density should be part of the review criteria in the
Oh,
statement
so
for
then we
that.
probably would.
Yeah,
then it would
but
have to be a
I mean, you're gonna be into it regardless. Because I think we've got some other things in the, that we
Oh,
may
okay.
be into that ordinance anyway.
All
that,
right.
You know, so. And I do have another, if there's no other comments on this, you know, we can discuss where we want to go with this afterwards, but I do have, what did I do with it? I lost it again.
Well, before we do that, let's take a look at the road standards. Is everybody okay? Have they you had a chance to look through that? I think most, these things Jim has worked out with Nate. It's just to bring us more in line with really what,
Yeah, if we're gonna have a minor road, you know, and actually, when I talked to Nate, I mean, all the pavement is really thin by today's standards. I mean, when this was done, we had a different specification for pavement. And today, we've got more rock than asphalt in the mixes. So the thicknesses are thicker, basically. And that's all I changed.
okay.
And that and the shoulder. And
the shoulder.
And the shoulder. Which, again, if we're gonna start promoting pedestrian uses and connectivity, then either we should be either providing a sidewalk or some means, we don't want people walking in the middle of the street.
Right.
And that's just an easy thing, because the town can plow a shoulder as easy as they can plow the regular road. Sidewalks get into another piece of equipment and probably will never get done.
More money and effort.
Yeah, yeah,
The
curb
shoulder
it.
thing kind of solves it. I mean, I've been in commercial campuses where that's the deal.
Yeah.
Where, you know, we stripe it, and we can plow it right off, keep
Correct.
people out of the road.
Right.
I think that's a reasonable request.
Okay,
And, you know-
so the road standards okay? That we can,
There was one item in the road standards that I noticed, it's either confusing or redundant. Under where we just were, where you showed the street construction standards and the pavement depths were changed. Below that, in bases and pavements, letter B, number 1, it says, it gives a gradation requirements for the material that passes a 4-inch square sieve. And then on the next page, it gives another set of gradation requirements for material that passes a 3-inch sieve. And it seems to apply to the same thing. It's like
Yeah.
a double.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that.
We probably should just have one. I think what they left out was the crushed aggregate base is not in there.
Yeah, it looks like one should be base and one should be sub-base, is maybe where it should be, I don't know.
One should be crushed aggregate, which is usually rock, and then the other
Right.
should be aggregate sub-base, which would be sand and gravel. So it seems to be two descriptions of
No,
sand and gravel.
well, it may be a little bit of wordsmithing in here, but I think
Yeah.
the first one is sub-base. 4-inch sieve for the sub-base, and then I think because it says aggregate sub-base. And then the next one, it's the second sentence, but it says the aggregate base. You have 2 courses of gravel.
It doesn't, then there's nothing for the crushed aggregate. and crusher run stuff.
Yeah, and I think that sieve diag, I think this, it's been a while since these things have been touched, so like, again, they may be outdated.
Maybe just look at what
Yep, we'll go back
DOT
and-
has in their
Yeah.
descriptions, their definitions.
Oh,
for
no,
it,
I
using
can
the same
easily grab
gradations.
that, we can take a look at that. I wasn't even thinking about that when I was looking at this,
Yeah, I
but,
just happened to notice it because I was,
yeah, I mean, like the
Looking through all
type
those
B, the
rules.
type A, and the type D,
Yeah.
you know, we can go back and kind of mimic that sieve analysis for that. Because, I think actually we allow like the 6-inch minus for type D in the sub-base. But we'll clarify that.
Okay, so any other, because this is really separate, I mean, it doesn't need to link to our loop. Okay, so I guess these changes we can go with.
Okay? We just have to, do we want to, when we think about that, do we want to do it in one public hearing, all of the ordinance changes? Or
Yes.
do we want to do them
No.
in piece, all at once?
All at once.
Okay, so this one we can kind of clean up and prepare for when we get to that point.
Right,
Okay?
good to go.
Yep.
Considerably, running some real quick numbers on that.
And then Article 13,
Article 13, any other,
Extra for every hundred.
I got the language that Bruce recommended.
Yeah.
That's not marked up to, that's just contract.
I don't know.
first, just kind of from the board,
Maybe it's 10 grand by the time it's all marked up.
hey, pay attention down there. So the Article 13, first, the overall kind of, without getting into any of the particulars, is everybody comfortable with going in this direction?
I got the text
Anybody-
changes that Bruce recommended,
With
which
the-
I'll make. Yeah.
Okay, so then in more specific, then, I mean, is what's written up here okay to kind of move forward with? You'd like to see anything
Just
in
that one
addition?
comment on
Yep.
that.
One
We
comment?
got it.
Yeah.
I got it.
Everything else
Okay.
looks good to me.
So besides Greg, everybody's happy?
Yeah,
Wow. Are you happy?
I'm okay.
All right.
I know Kyle.
All right. Well, Kyle, okay, so I guess in this one, then this, Jim, we can move
Okay.
ahead with as well.
So now moving on to other ordinances, after talking with Mr. Dvorak today. These are some that have popped up, and whether we want to grab a piece of them, discuss them in general, and then pick out some that we want to think about. I'm just going to quickly run through them, then I'll kind of come back and discuss. We have some issues with signs.
Yeah.
Food truck and vendors licensing, special events, emergency housing, temporary shelter, accessory apartments where consideration of exempt from lot density, recommendation from our attorney about penalty verbiage within the land use, about civil penalties. We just talked about connectivities, and I think to your point, the fire department, sprinkler requirements for large residents outside of subdivision. I talked a little bit about net residential, and then Greg's timber harvesting question. So going through, I think that the one thing that's come up with signs is, again, a recommendation from our attorney about some, I guess, landmark court cases where it's,
Superior Court case in 2015, that our sign verbiage, our sign ordinances should be more general
Be more general.
instead of looking at signs in different categories. It should be a more generalized ordinance. We were looking at it through a whole different issue, and it popped up, and he read it. The town attorney said that there was a superior, he goes, we need to revisit that because the Superior Court found it, basically what it dealt with was a church sign. And because it was noted that church signs had a different ordinance than some other signs, that you couldn't do that. And he says there are some verbiage in our sign ordinance that kind of is like that as well. That he suggested that we rewrite it, not total rewrite, but just some more generalization in some of the signs.
Don't we have the design guidelines for signs?
You do, but this goes with placement of signs, where they can be put at.
Oh, okay.
the content on them and things
Yeah.
like that. So I think the attorney's got some recommendations or some
Yeah.
drafts that he could provide us, that we could look at that.
Okay,
As far as food truck vendors, they're becoming more popular. The issue we're having is the amount of licenses we have available and the very limited window that they have to apply for those. I don't know how and why we got into such a limitation on the application. I don't know if it's if there's anything really in there about the actual location of where they can set up, but I think it's more about the amount of licenses and the time frame that they can apply for.
Yep, what a lot of them are doing, towns now to also, just to have, where they want locations of trash cans, how often they are, that all the trash is removed by them. I've had two more inquiries about this over the summer.
really? That,
And they missed the boat because you have to apply for it in April.
People aren't thinking about summer food trucks in April.
And like I said, it all depends on which way you guys as a board decide to go with that. It's still, right now, they have to be issued by the selectmen, which is fine, but maybe my thought would just be make it a little easier on the time frame, that they just don't have that one window.
is this really a planning board function?
Well, it's an ordinance
It's
change.
an
It's an ordinance.
It's an ordinance
change,
change,
so
so we have to promote it.
Yeah, so.
We don't have any enforcement of it. It's between Scott and the Board of Selectmen,
Yeah.
but we have to kind of initiate the recommendation for the change.
Okay. Well, I think everyone's okay, so let's go ahead and go.
Okay. Special events.
Whatever makes sense, Scott.
Special events, it's a broad stroke. Looking at people who host large parties, wedding venues, things like that. We really don't have an ordinance that covers that. We have a special amusement, which that doesn't really fall into that category. And this comes more into life safety issues, where if somebody's hosting, or whether it's commercially or even just residential, right, or
Yeah.
private, there's a certain size where we get into traffic issues, waste issues, noise, everything like that. And not that the board would have, again, any jurisdiction on reviewing that, but we would give Scott and the Board of Selectmen a little bit of teeth to issue some permits, and then have the fire department to review that for all those different things.
Makes sense.
I think one of the catalysts we keep seeing in this and other communities is barn events, and what point does the barn event become a commercial use, and what provisions does it need to provide for the event, from, safety provisions and everything like that, and what impact does it have on neighborhood if it's in a,
So this would be a brand new ordinance.
yes.
Yep.
Another ordinance.
I'm in favor of the paper reduction act.
So Greg would like font 2.
That's what you fit in one paragraph. And I don't know if it needs to be anything huge, but I think it's just, again, some kind of measure that the town can track. And we're not gonna try to, if you're having a birthday party, you have 30, 40 people, we're not gonna track that, but it's for when you get into 100 or 150 people for a wedding or something of that nature, and you get into parking and those kind of things. It's the larger events we're trying to look out for.
So we're looking at more like the camp events.
Yeah, I mean, something like that, because most of the time, so they are notified, because if something, a large gathering like that, if something was to happen, they would, at least they would know something's going to be going on that weekend.
And I think in some towns that, mass gathering ordinances, what I've noticed in some towns is they're talking hundreds and thousands of people under the mass gathering ordinances. I don't expect that to be the case, but I have seen some towns that anything over 100 is considered a mass gathering, so. That's why we just kind of said special events. It might be just more, homey and a little bit more descriptive than just mass gathering, because I don't think people who are throwing a wedding venue think they're throwing a mass gathering.
Yeah, but I mean, what special event could be?
Right,
You
but I
could
think we
do
would
it-
define what,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you
okay.
could, and you could, some towns even tier it, 50 under, 50 over, there's a different,
Okay.
all different scenarios.
Yeah, and then, from the fire perspective with these gatherings, is just making sure that it's a safe event. An example, either the barn venue or like the tents that people set up for either that barn venue or other larger gatherings. They don't think about exits, maintaining aisle width, so that people can escape. And not all the time are these events held in good weather. A lot of times, you know, whether it's bad weather, they got like on a tent, they got curtains that come down. They're just not thinking about exits. And with a permit, we can kind of look at their layout or look at what they're doing and say, you need to do this, this, and this.
Yeah, it'd probably go hand in
to
hand
make it
with maybe
safe.
special events for even like liquor licenses or things like that too. I don't know. Because I know when you run certain events and you have liquor there, you need a temporary liquor license or
Right.
something
Do
like
you
that. So it
need
might
if
go hand in
it's-
foot.
If it's free and for guests, or if it's being sold?
Yeah, well, to your point, but I mean, I'm thinking it would run hand in hand with that, but either that, I mean, it's just, you come into Scott, get a permit, basically, and it's more of a notification process for the fire department. Everybody know that this thing's going on. The other thing too is it might be able to chance to put some limitations on noise and time of operation, so they
Yep.
don't go into the wee hours of the morning and disturb all.
Are we having that problem now?
A little bit, not bad.
Oh, but it is cropping up.
Kinda, yeah.
Okay.
And like I said, one of my biggest things.
You don't hear it in your neighborhood?
Lakes are worse.
They are, I know.
I mean, some of the things, you know, certain things like some of the gatherings that they have at the school and something like that are exempt, you know, could be exempt from that. I mean, it's just something that you would kind of have to figure out what you would really like to gather in underneath that.
Okay.
Next one, emergency housing. Scott brought this one up. It's in the event of, you know, tragic event where somebody's house burns and they bring in a temporary trailer or,
I mean, we had one that had a house burnt. He had to move out of his house, but it was on the Cape, which is in shoreland zone, but the temporary house is a mobile home, which isn't allowed. So if we can do something in our, what we came up with was a letter signed by the people who dropped off, the homeowner and the town manager. You know, a permit had to be in 90 days after the house was dropped off. Construction had to continue, and then it's to be removed at a certain amount of time. It's just, if it happened once, it's gonna happen again.
Sure.
So I always, since we couldn't find anything, we came up with a letter, but if we had something in our ordinance that was something that we could just fall back
Okay.
on very easily.
accessory apartments exempt from lot density. Obviously, these accessory units are, formerly, I think they were considered in-law apartment type things, but we realized we couldn't really enforce who was living in there, but they're restricted by size of under 700 square feet. And the idea is that, you know, I don't believe that in any of these cases we've used the lot density to determine 2 units versus, you know, 1 unit when we did accessory units.
Right.
So the idea is just to put some language in there to say that, just to kind of, you know, you get one exemption for a accessory unit.
Because the confusing part was you look at what a unit is in the definitions, and the accessory apartment really doesn't really call into it. It just is very generalized as to what it is. So if you really look at it, an accessory apartment is a dwelling unit, which means it would be subject to the standards, which could be double the lot.
So if you had 80,000 square feet for the single family, does that mean you need 80,000 additional for the accessory unit? No.
No,
That's
right.
not what our intention is, but if you read,
If you looked at it the way
look
it's
for the
worded.
definitions, it could imply that.
Yeah.
We want to eliminate that.
I think we looked at that, we didn't even, when we changed that ordinance, I don't think we looked at,
I don't think we were even thinking about that.
no, nor were we thinking about the amount of land that gets cleared because
Right.
of that.
Right.
You know, and I'm wondering when we visit this, if we want to have some sort of, you know, it made sense at the time. You know, if you have an apartment, what's the difference?
Well, I think we were
Right.
thinking in-law apartment, and then it went from in-law apartment to a general accessory apartment.
Right,
And we didn't think of the implications of land on the accessory apartment and how many of these things could pop up.
exactly.
To your point, maybe it's not the full lot density, maybe it's 20,000 for the accessory, additional 20,000 or something to that nature.
Right,
But it's something I think we do need to kind of look at and clarify.
I agree.
Because I mean, I could all of a sudden see everybody have an accessory apartment and make a
Right.
little extra revenue and.
Yes,
Well, shoreland zoning already kind of cuts a lot of that out because they already, no matter what, they define it as a dwelling.
Yes.
So that automatically, anybody in
This is
shoreland
outside
has to have.
shoreline.
right.
Penalty verbiage, again, from the attorneys, I think they're gonna provide us some language updating our civil penalties for violations and things in the shoreline, not the shoreline, the regular zones. Again, it's nothing that you necessarily get involved with, but it's an ordinance change.
Okay.
Sprinklers for large residents, I think we're starting to see some extravagant large homes. And right now, the only time we apply the sprinkler standard is in the case of subdivisions,
Yep.
where you can't get hydrants. So, I mean, maybe Wayne wants to talk to this one as well, but in some of these larger homes where we're talking 3,000 or 4,000 beyond, you know, should we be requiring sprinklers? The fire department has it.
Yeah, on these larger dwellings, and we ran across one this past year. There was no way that we would be able to provide the fire flow to protect the building, and so it's just having a mechanism that's reasonable to on these large residential dwellings, that there's no way that we can supply that fire flow is to make sure that they're sprinklered.
What size home does that become problematic for you?
I'll have to
I know
look.
you're gonna say 1,000.
No. I'll look at the square footage
Yeah.
and cubic footage and
But we're
come up
talking these,
with
we're
a
not
number for
talking,
you.
we're talking very large residential structures here. We're not talking your average colonials or big colonials like that.
But Wayne, you said about water flow, you're talking about putting out a fire.
Yep.
It was I thought it was explained to me that that the sprinkler system was designed basically to get people out, not to put the fire out.
And on these larger residential dwellings, there's different sprinkler systems that you can use. And on these larger ones, and this one that popped up this year, that really is driving this, that's not going to be the system that you've been seeing with the plans that have come before the board this year. It's still a residential system, but it has more flow capability. So yes, it's getting them out, but it's also protecting more of the building.
Okay.
It's not a huge fire flow demand for to install that sprinkler. There's not a huge. It's basically what we're talking about is 2 heads. Right now, on the plans that you've seen, it's the fire flow for 2 sprinkler heads, and in this larger dwelling, it's 4 sprinkler heads. So that's the difference that we're talking about, really.
Those are just standard sprinkler heads you see in commercial buildings, is that what you're?
No, it's much less than a commercial building. You know, a commercial build, there's 3 different sprinkler standards. One is what you think of as in a commercial building or a school or a public building. Then there's this one that we're talking about, which is larger residential buildings. And then what we've been dealing with is the single-family home sprinkler. So there's 3 different sprinkler standards out there.
Is that like a 13R?
Yeah, 13R. Yep.
Now, this is just food for thought to bounce off the wall. I'm not against sprinkler systems. We've got the size question of where are we gonna cut it off, where are we gonna start it?
Right.
And then, I'm sure Greg would appreciate this, if the homeowner doesn't wanna pay for a sprinkler system and wants to assume the risk, is there any way to offset that and